Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
I understand. I know it's not your typical resume.
Okay, well...
But... candidate. But I've been working double shifts just to pay for books. I've been raising my 2 little brothers. I'm determined, driven, motivated. Isn't that what you're looking for?
Look beyond the resume and discover new ways to develop great talent at gradsoflife.org.
My name is Catherine Klussman, and I oversee community and family programming here at the Rock Hall. Our mission here is to engage, teach, and inspire through the power of rock and roll, and we're so pumped to have all of you here today. We're hosting today's event, Cuyahoga 50 at North Coast Harbor, with the Great Lakes Science Center and the City of Cleveland, their Office of Sustainability. Today's celebration is all about how far the city and the region has come since that fire on the Cuyahoga in '69. They've been doing tons of citywide celebrations, and so we're excited to cap off the weekend with some great activation here and at the Science Center. There's tons of community organizations who are all doing the boots on the ground work to help keep our region clean and healthy, and we're thrilled to welcome them all here. We've got some great bands and a science demo happening, but first things first, I'm going to turn it over to some of our speakers from our partners here today.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Ellenbogen. I'm President and CEO of Great Lakes Science Center, and welcome to the continuing celebration of Cuyahoga 50. We are so excited to be a part of this. We're honored to be part of the City of Cleveland and the extraordinary work that's been going on for 50 years in this community, in clean air, in clean water. And as I look around and see so many children today, I'm excited to think about what the next 50 years will bring for Cleveland and its leadership in clean water. I know you're here to hear some wonderful speakers, so I will turn you over to that, but let me tell you, please stop by Great Lakes Science Center. We have so much going on, and we have partners from all over the community here who are here to share with you the great work they're doing in clean water all over our region. You're going to want to come and see this. You'll get to try out a 3D printed spectrometer. You will get to look at algal blooms and how they form using augmented reality. NASA's there using some VR and talking about their work. Please come by, enjoy the free day. Thank you, Cleveland.
Thank you. Next up, we have Matt Gray, the Chief of Sustainability from the City of Cleveland's Office of Sustainability. Him and his office are doing some tremendous work throughout the entire region, particularly spearheading all of these Cuyahoga 50 events and initiatives. It's really been some great work, tons of awesome things going on. It's been a wonderful committee to be a part of, and I just want to turn it over to Matt, so thank you.
Good morning, or is it afternoon? Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Matt Gray, Chief of Sustainability with the City of Cleveland. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a perfect way to cap off 5 days of celebration, and really 5 days of celebrating 50 years of progress. I think looking back to 1969, specifically June 22nd, 1969 was the last time our river burned. Of course, it burned 12 times before that, dating back to 1868. Which is crazy to think about, 1868. So this was business as usual for over 100 years. But in 1969, things changed, right? It was building off a decade of advocacy and leaders on the ground pushing for clean air and clean water. And we had an incredible mayor back then, Mayor Carl Stokes. He was the first African-American mayor of a major city in the country. And he took this issue to heart. Even before 1969. In 1968, they spent $100 million to begin cleaning up our water. But he knew that was not enough. We needed the federal government to step up. So in 1969, when this fire happened, the next day he went down to the river. He brought the media and he said, this is not acceptable for the people of Cleveland, for everyone. It's just not acceptable. Then he and his brother, Louis Stokes, congressman at the time, went to DC and said, we can do a lot in Cleveland, but we need help. So the next year, US EPA got founded. 2 years later, the Clean Water Act got founded. And that's really been the law of the land ever since. So we think back to the people who came before us and all the people over 50 years who really have helped contribute to what we see behind us here in Lake Erie and also in the river this way. So just one quick applause for all those people over the years who've cleaned our water. So we aren't done. I don't know if you've noticed, we've had a lot of rain. And we have record high water in Lake Erie right now. And if you've seen the river, it's also very high. All this progress wasn't by accident, and that is not by accident. A lot of what we're doing is as the cause of climate change. We're going to get more rain. This is going to become the new normal, and this is something we have to deal with. So the message is really we're celebrating 50 years, but we also have a lot of work to do, and we need your help, everyone's help, to continue addressing all these clean water challenges. So thank you for celebrating with us this weekend, and let's keep the progress going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I know everybody is thrilled about the clean water and how great the river is. My favorite hobby is kayaking, particularly on the Cuyahoga, and I love that I can go down there and feel safe and feel excited and see a clean environment, see the wildlife, see what's going on there. What we're going to do now is we're going to turn it over to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's going to talk a little bit about his organization. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is an attorney, author, and longtime environmental activist. 20 years ago, he founded the nonprofit organization Waterkeepers Alliance, which now has 346 waterkeeper groups that work to preserve local waterways in 46 countries, protecting more than 2.7 million square miles of rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. That's pretty impressive. We're thrilled to have Mr. Kennedy here today to share his insights on how the burning of the Cuyahoga River impacts water quality issues today and where we can go from here. So let's welcome Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the burning of the Cuyahoga. It's a strange thing to be commemorating, but we remember it because of the critical impact it had on creating a whole new infrastructure of environmental laws in this country, of changing the way that Americans look at the environment and care for and steward our Purple Mountain's majesty. And it is a critical object lesson for us to remember today as political forces in Washington, led by the White House, are dismantling the Clean Water Act and threatening to return us to an era where rivers may one day again burn. The new proposals to eviscerate the Clean Water Act will remove protection of 20% of America's rivers and streams, all federal protection, and about 50% of this country's wetlands. So it's something we really have to fight. And one of the local leaders in battling to keep the Clean Water Act functioning for the American citizens is Sandy Bin, who's the Lake Erie waterkeeper and is over there. Will you please wave, Sandy? Oh, I remember I was 15 years old in 1969, and I remember what it was like before the Cuyahoga River burned and before Earth Day 1970, which was one of the outcomes of that tragedy, of that event. I remember that I couldn't swim in the Hudson, the Charles, or the Potomac when I was a little boy. I remember what the air smelled like in Washington, D.C., having cinders on my shirt when I went to school, to Catholic school in Washington, D.C. There were tens of thousands of Americans who died every year during smog events. People don't remember that today. The eastern and Adams peregrine falcon, the most spectacular predatory bird in North America, went extinct in 1963, the same year that my uncle was killed. The Cuyahoga River burned in '69. Lake Erie was declared dead in 69. This was the richest fishery in the entire Great Lakes. It has 2% of the water in the Great Lakes. 50% of the fish come out of that waterway because it's so rich. Zero dissolved oxygen. That waterway was dead, something that nobody could have imagined, that human beings could do that to such an extraordinary large resource. And of course, the Cuyahoga burned, and 2 months before the Cuyahoga burn, the Santa Barbara oil spill blackened the beaches in Southern California and destroyed a tourist industry that was based on that connection to the waterways. And Americans, inspired by that series of environmental insults, 20 million Americans came out onto the street on Earth Day 1970, April 22nd, the largest public demonstration in American history at that time. 10% of our population, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been taken from our citizens over the previous 80 years. And frightened and inspired by this vast outpouring of democratic power and strength, political leaders on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, got together and over the next 11 years passed 28 major environmental laws: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, RCRA, CERCLA, and the Endangered Species Act, and so on, that now have created this legal infrastructure that allows us to sleep at night knowing that somebody is caring for those waterways, and allowed us ultimately to restore waterways like the Cuyahoga River. I was down there this morning and I watched people on paddle boards. I watched people in kayaks and in shells paddling on the river. And that's something that was unimaginable at a time when that waterway was simply regarded as a waste conveyance system, a piece of the sewage infrastructure of this city, owned by the refineries and the other big industries who had privatized that public waterway. And the group that I have spent the last 35 years with, as Sandy is also part of, started that year as well in a little village called Crotonville, New York, 30 miles up the Hudson River on the east bank of the river. And it was a fishing village. And at that time, we had a booming commercial fishery on the Hudson, the oldest commercial fishery in North America, 350 years old. Many of the people I've represented for 35 years come from families that have been fishing the river continuously for 3.5 centuries. And one of the enclaves on the Hudson of the commercial fishery was this little village called Crotonville. The people who lived there in 1966 were not your prototypical affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or crabbing the Hudson. These were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the national parks. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes in the Hudson River. It was their property values. It was their livelihood. It was their recreational values, and it was their health and their food supply. In 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard. The oil went up the river on the tides, just as it did in the Cuyahoga. It blackened the beaches. It made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold in the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all of the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town in March of that year, the Parker Bale American Legion Hall. It was a very patriotic community. Crotonville had one of the highest mortality rates during World War II of any community in the country. Almost all the original founders, board members, and officers and members of Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II, Korea, and later Vietnam. These weren't radicals. They weren't militants. They were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night, they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries. their parents had exploited for generations the purity of the water, and it was being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, the Corps of Engineers, the State Conservation Department, the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. They were told by the Corps Colonel after 20 separate visits, the Corps of Engineers Colonel in Manhattan, by the leaders of what was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, begging him to do his job and save their livelihoods and shut down the Penn Central Pipe. He finally told them, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we can't force them to comply with the law because they're too important. And by this evening, in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government is in cahoots with the polluters. The only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. Somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central Pipe and burn it up. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else suggested that they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. Then a man stood up whose name was Bob Boyle. He was a combat veteran from Korea. He was a first lieutenant. He was the outdoor editor for Sports Illustrated magazine. He was there for 65 years writing about hunting and fishing. And he was one of the gurus of dry fly tying and fly fishing in this country. He'd written 6 books on angling. 2 years before, he wrote an article for Sports Illustrated about angling in the Hudson. And in researching that article, he came across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And Boyle had sent a copy of the law to the libel lawyers at Time Magazine, which owns Sports Illustrated, and said, is this still good law? They sent him a memo back saying in 80 years, it's never been enforced. It's still on the books, and you can still enforce it. And that evening, there were 300 people in the American Legion Hall talking about violence. And Boyle stood up in front of them with a copy of the law, a memo from the lawyers, and he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that evening that they were going to start a group that was then called Hudson River Fishermen's Association, and later became Riverkeeper. They were going to go out, track down, and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe. They got to keep $2,000. They used that money to go after Ciba-Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brands, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America. In 1973, they collected $200,000, the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter, against Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat. They began patrolling the river. In 1983, they hired their first full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me as using bounty money a year later as the attorney. And since then, we've won over 500 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters. Hudson today Hudson was a national joke. In 1966, it caught fire. It turned colors depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. It was dead for 20-mile stretches like Lake Erie because of no oxygen. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left that still has strong spawning stocks in the Atlantic Ocean. Of all of its historical species of migratory fish, it's Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse, and the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation of waterkeepers now around the world. We own the name, we license new groups to get started, they become part of our networks. There are now 350 of us in 44 countries, each one with a patrol boat, and each one with a full-time waterkeeper like Sandy Ben, who has committed her lifetime to saving your community waterways. I want to say two quick things about the philosophy behind Waterkeeper, and one of them I learned very early on. These were commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen. They were people who were getting wet, who were up to their knees in mud, who loved the waterway. They didn't say, it's nature, look, but don't touch. They said, we belong in nature. We're part of it, and we get unhealthy when we get too far away from it. And they taught me very early on, we're not protecting these waterways for the sake of the fishes and the birds so much. We're protecting it for our own sake, because we recognize that nature enriches us. It enriches us economically, spiritually, culturally, in every other way. And it's part of our infrastructure. And if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create opportunities for our children and provide them with the same richness that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those things that you can't reduce to private property ownership, but by their nature, they're part of the commonwealth, they're part of the commons, they're assets that are owned by the entire population. And nature, and a lot of people, you'll hear a lot of the big polluters and their indentured servants on Capitol Hill and their toadies on TV, etc. You'll hear them say, we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the Koch brothers and Exxon and Smithfield and corporate agriculture and factory farms are asking us to do, which is to treat our planet and this river as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity. We can do that, and we can create a few billionaires, or we're going to impoverish the rest of us. And our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time, and that we will never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done over the past 35 years as an environmental advocate is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It isn't. It's an investment in infrastructure. Just the same as investing in telecommunications or road construction, it's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic prosperity of our generation and future generations. There is nobody who can tell that story with more feeling and fervent truthfulness than the people of Cleveland, because you know what happened when you cleaned up this river and what it done, how it triggered the resurgence of this city. There's no way that the revitalization that is taking place now in Cleveland could ever happen if that river were a floating oil slick that periodically immolated in flames. It couldn't be done. Oh, I want to thank Cleveland for its commitment to its river, for being an example, a template to all of us around the country. And let's all remember the Cuyahoga River burning in 1969 and pledge that no matter what our politicians say, we're not going to allow them, no matter how much money they take from the big polluters, we're not going to allow them to bring us back to that kind of America. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Everybody give it up for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and all the amazing work the Waterkeepers Alliance is doing around the globe.